Hello, and welcome to Fraud Eat Strategy, a white collar forensic podcast series in which we explore the myriad ways that financial crime, corruption, and misconduct can derail strategy and cause havoc. I'm Scott Moritz, president of White Collar Forensic, where we assist clients and their outside counsel in managing their response to white collar crime, money laundering, and bribery incidents, assist in the pursuit of financial recovery, and help fix the things that were exposed as broken along the way. Thank you for listening. So, Mexico is a critically important trading partner with the US. Together with China and Canada, the three account for 36.5% of all US imports and 32.1% of all US exports, amounting to over $1 trillion of trade each year. And yet, Mexico is always a challenging country in which to do business. The gap between the wealthiest and the poorest is enormous. Violent crime and gun violence is extremely prevalent. Government and police corruption is widespread. And Mexico is amongst the largest producers of cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl. In addition to being a narcotics source country, because it borders the US, it is a major narcotics transshipment country, and all of the money generated by narcotics trafficking has to be laundered. In fact, Mexican money launderers are amongst the most innovative, who make use of a combination of trade-based money laundering, traditional money laundering through cash-intensive businesses, bulk smuggling of US currency, the black market peso exchange, and other proven and widely used money laundering techniques. On a more positive note, Mexico is also a huge trading and manufacturing partner for a wide range of goods, including automobiles, car parts, clothing, housewares, precious metals, oil and gas, and a huge volume of agricultural products. Mexico is fraught with risk, and tensions between Mexico and the US are arguably at an all-time high. And yet our two economies and national security are inextricably linked. So how do US companies with significant operations in Mexico continue to operate there? And what should companies who are considering investing in the Mexico market do to mitigate all of this uncertainty? As daunting as all of this may sound, as it turns out, all you need to do is to talk to some experts. So joining me today are Madison Ellis and Mike Belcher. Matt is a partner and leads Miller and Chevrolet's globally recognized Latin America practice. He guides clients on cross-border internal investigations and corporate compliance strategies to address bribery and corruption, U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act allegations, anti-terrorism and foreign terrorist organizations, fraud, economic sanctions, anti-money laundering, business and human rights, forced labor, multilateral development bank sanctions, workplace misconduct, which includes sexual harassment, discrimination and retaliation, conflicts of interest, and other sensitive ethics and compliance matters. Matt leads independent investigations. He performs compliance due diligence in mergers and acquisitions and builds corporate compliance strategies to align with the expectations of the U.S. Department of Justice, the SEC, and other global regulators. As a multilingual attorney, Matt has performed on-site investigations in a very impressive number of countries, 40, including throughout the Americas, Asia, Europe, and Africa. He's recognized as a leader in Latin America, having been selected as a Chambers Global and Chambers Latin America Band 1 attorney for corporate crime and investigations in the region for more than a decade. He previously worked as a litigation specialist and investigator at the World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank, and is fluent in Portuguese and Spanish. Taylor Mike Belcher is an investigator with White Collar Forensic who specializes in investigations in Mexico and Brazil. Prior to his current role, Mike served for 11 years as vice president and regional security director for Latin America and the Caribbean for Goldman Sachs and Company, where he was responsible for security issues affecting the company, and to include physical security, crisis management, fire and life safety, executive protection, and travel security. Mike was an operations officer with the Central Intelligence Agency with extensive experience in Latin America and Europe. While at CIA, he was a founding member of its counterterrorism center, and later served as chief of operations liaison with U.S. federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. He received his MA in Latin American Studies from Indiana University at Bloomington and his BA from Castleton State College in Vermont. He has lived and worked in Mexico, Scotland, Cyprus, Canada, Lebanon, France, Brazil, Portugal, and Spain, and has had tours in Washington, D.C. and New York. He's a member of the CIA Retiree Association, Association of Former Intelligence Officers, and the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Well, thank you both, Matt and Mike, for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
So, since President Trump's inauguration, the administration has focused a great deal of attention on Mexico. On day one of the Trump administration, President Trump issued an executive order designating numerous Mexico-based organized crime cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. DOJ prosecutors have been instructed to prioritize the investigation of the drug trade, human trafficking, and violent crime by transnational criminal organizations, consistent with the directive for the total elimination of cartels. Most recently, the U.S. Department of Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, issued sanctions against 3 Mexican financial institutions on June 25th of 2025, prohibiting U.S. financial institutions from transmitting any funds to or from these entities. This move can potentially be devastating to Mexico, since designating a bank as what is termed a financial institution of primary money laundering concern isolates those banks from the global banking community, making it nearly impossible for them to survive. Let's start with this last point. What happens to a bank once it's designated as a primary money laundering concern, and how does it affect the customers of those banks?
Great. Well, I'll jump in. And Scott, thank you so much for this opportunity. I've always been a fan of Fraud Eats Strategy, and to be on now talking about such an important topic, it really is a treat for me. Thanks. And Mike, so wonderful to share the microphone with you. Look, these orders by the Department of Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, are striking, and they are significant developments. You know, along the lines of your introduction, Scott, it is clear that the Trump administration has deployed the Department of Justice, Treasury, other groups within the federal government to focus on cartels, organized crime, fentanyl. But up until these orders, that really came in the form of, sanctioning individuals who were close to cartel leaders or sanctioning bulk cash smugglers at the border. But with these FinCEN orders against 3 reputable financial institutions in Mexico, it's really a shot across the bow. It's a wake-up call that, look, legitimate companies, legitimate businesses, legitimate banks can be in the crosshairs if there are indications that they're providing support to cartels, to organized crime. FinCEN itself call these orders unprecedented. And so what's quite interesting, though, is in a way, the market has overreacted to the orders, because when you read the sanctions themselves, they are quite limited. They don't apply to any company. They only apply to covered financial institutions, banks, broker-dealers, money service providers, casinos. They don't apply to companies outside of that scope. And they aren't complete sanctions, as one would expect with a SDN designation, an OFAC designation. No, they're only prohibiting a certain type of conduct, as you say, the transmittal of funds to and from those three entities from the covered financial institutions. So they don't restrict normal companies from doing anything. Those companies can still open accounts. They can still hire these financial institutions to serve as trustees, etc. But the market has greatly overreacted. And as you say, it's really put the livelihood of these institutions in great jeopardy. It's caused a number of companies in the market to decide not to continue doing business with these entities. And so, in a way, one might say that FinCEN overshot, or one might say that the market overreacted. But something is going on here to wake up the markets and highlight, these new and emerging risks in Mexico.
Thanks. Thanks. Yeah, I think that's spot on. So, with all of this happening, plus the imposition of very high tariffs, which seems to be a moving target, and a crackdown on illegal immigration, what can U.S. and other foreign companies expect to happen as they continue to operate in Mexico, as many organizations do? And what should they do in order to safeguard their operations? Let's start with Mike.
All right, Scott, thank you very much. And I'm happy to be on this this podcast, the first one for me at least, and very happy to meet Matt and look forward to future events. Looking at your question and what Matt has said, in spite of everything that's going on, I mean, Mexico and the U.S. Continue to be number one in terms of trading partners. Foreign investment and direct foreign investment in Mexico over the last 2 years has continued to rise, and the projections are that it will continue to rise in 2025. And public statements from the current Mexican administration support growing foreign investment in a number of areas. So I think in that sense, I sort of have an optimistic view. That said, that can all break down very, very quickly. And so I think a number of companies are adopting a sort of wait and see policy, primarily due to uncertainty regarding tariffs, but also uncertainty regarding upcoming midterm elections in the United States, because a lot of this could change in tone and tenor depending upon how that breaks down. I think for U.S. companies doing business, given these uncertainties, it's critical to have backup plans depending on several contingencies that they may have to face. One would be, obviously, as I said, an improvement in the foreign investment area, improvement in U.S. relations, but on the other side, a deterioration of those relations. And that said, it takes very, very little for relations between Mexico and the United States to deteriorate, and very quickly at that, either by action or words. I think one of the key things you mentioned, the cartels and the actions that are being taken by the government in terms of the banking is one thing. One thing that concerns me the most is any direct unilateral action on the part of the United States using military force to go after the cartels would deteriorate the situation incredibly. And certainly any action on U.S. or on Mexican soil that is such a tender spot with Mexicans, given the history between the two countries, that basically would signal disaster in terms of relations between the two countries. I guess the good news is there is cooperation on that narcotics front, especially to date, and especially with the more conservative and trustworthy Navy. Sort of historically, the Navy has been an easier partner to work with than have state, federal police authorities. So in a sense, overall, I'm positive, and hopefully this will wind up being a good start for the future of U.S.-Mexican relations.
I have to say, I agree with everything Mike says. The only thing I would add is, another thing that companies with presence in Mexico, both Mexican companies and U.S. companies, by the way, what they can do is understand this new emerging legal enforcement environment, the new ways in which companies can fall under the scrutiny of the Department of Justice or the Department of Treasury in particular, the risk of providing material support to designated entities, to cartels that have been designated as foreign terrorist organizations, FTOs, and the type of criminal and civil liability that material support can create. And that can come in the form of making security payments on highways or having relationships with third-party vendors who happen to be front organizations from cartels. Scott, you mentioned that risk in your introductory remarks. It can be looking the other way when automobiles or precursors to fentanyl are being stolen from your operations and perhaps not being as diligent as you should in preventing that theft from occurring. These interactions and support to cartels can happen in so many ways in Mexico. And now, given the new legal risks at play, it really is important that companies are taking well thought out strategies to ensure that their compliance controls are calibrated in a way to address these new and emerging risks.
Thanks, Matt. So the U.S. Department of State maintains a list of country profiles and issues travel advisories to countries that are specific to countries that may pose safety concerns to business travelers and tourists. And travel advisories are numbered from 1 to 4, with 1 being the safest country to travel to, with those designated 3 or 4. They're accompanied by the terms for number 3, reconsider travel, and for 4, do not travel. Those are terms that aren't really subject to interpretation, right? And large swaths of Mexico carry cautions of either reconsider or do not travel due to the crime and kidnapping issues and their prevalence. So business travelers and tourists often are unaware of the crime problem. And people, I think it's fair to say tourists don't routinely check the Department of State travel advisories when deciding on their travel destination. And sometimes they make poor choices as a result. So what advice would you give to a business traveler or tourist on how to avoid becoming a victim of a crime when traveling to Mexico?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Yeah, I think as you mentioned, the State Department, their website has a complete section devoted to travel safety issues and country reports. And I think it's very good advice for people to look at those. I would also recommend looking at the websites for the foreign ministries of Canada and the United Kingdom, because they also have good travel advice. There's a lot of politics at play sometimes of what's on those advisories, and sometimes they seem to be rather extreme, but it really does depend on exactly where you're going and what you're going to be doing. I mean, if you're in the mining industry or you're starting a new business, building a factory, and you're visiting there, that's completely different from going into having, let's say, business meetings in Mexico City or Querétaro or Monterrey. The security precautions that need to be taken do differ. So one recommendation for anybody going down to do business, and I'm primarily focused on business travelers, is to have a good understanding of where it is you're going to be going, exactly what you're going to be doing, and getting security advice from either an international company or from a local Mexican company that specializes in that area. But if you're using a local company, you have to do your due diligence on exactly which company you're doing business with. For travelers, tourists, business, no matter what reason, one key thing, check your documents before you leave. I've heard too many nightmare stories of people arriving, and in Mexico, for example, the passport's due to expire within 6 months and you're not coming into the country. So you need to double check that. You need to make copies of those documents and keep them stored separately. You need to bring along but regarding health, you need to bring along copies of prescriptions, any drugs, have them in the original containers. You need to consider travel insurance and medevac insurance, depending upon where you're going. Beyond that, the major point I like to point out, you absolutely have to be aware of, it sounds trite and we always hear it, but it's always good to listen to it again because sometimes you just put it out of your mind. But you absolutely have to be aware of your surroundings and where you are, where you're going. My advice has always been, you're leaving your hotel, just stop, look around, take a few minutes to see, cars parked across the street, people on the street, what's going on around you. Is there anything that looks out of the ordinary? Listen to what's going on. I always say take a 360-degree look around you, especially when you're walking down the street, to make sure that nobody's paying undue attention to you. The other advice, we always say this, it was a lot more difficult, let's say 10 years ago when we didn't have Uber. But never hail a taxi on the street unless you're, I'll leave it at that. Just never hail a taxi on the street. You can call an Uber in Mexico City or anywhere in Mexico now from your cell phone. It's simple. Or you can use the hotel car service. Another issue is money. Bring cash with you. Never use outdoor ATM machines. Always use ATM machines inside banks or hotels. Keep a close watch out on your phone, your laptop, and where possible, use a VPN. um, the laptops and the phones are not secure. It's too easy for them to be cloned. So you do need to be careful with that, especially if you're carrying sensitive information on whatever business deal you're working on. Entertainment, you're going out with business colleagues or people you're going to start doing business with. Check with the hotel concierge regarding good places to go. Your local hosts will certainly have ideas. Take their advice first. You can Google information as far as travel is concerned in restaurants. Be very careful of bars and discos. I've been down there so many times. I've been to a number of them. The other area is Mexico is famous for a number of various red light districts. The best advice when it comes to that is don't. That can get you into more trouble than you can ever imagine, both from a personal, perspective in terms of safety and health. So again, don't. I'm trying to think if sure I've got more to say on the subject. Specifically, the key point is you've got to be aware of what's going on around you. Don't be listening to try not to talk on the phone when you're walking in the street. Avoid the earphone. They don't fit in my ears. They keep falling out. But that's a fast way not to understand what's going on around you. But those are just some of the key points that I would make and happy to discuss further.
So it's fair to say that your remarks were probably the antithesis of what the Mexican Tourist Bureau might be saying in a public setting in terms of to attract tourists there. And the things that we take for granted here that you can do, like hailing a taxi or just, kind of eating at an outdoor cafe that you think you take for granted and you assume are safe activities. That's not necessarily. Mexico's certainly a challenging environment.
Yeah, and Scott, I would just to interject, despite of everything I've said, I've found Mexico, for the most part, to be one of the safest places I've ever gone to. I've gone to some fairly difficult places, but that's not the kind of place that most tourists or businessmen would go. But if you look at Mexico City is probably, depending upon where you are in Mexico City, probably one of the safest cities in the world right now. So I've thumbs up and have a good time in Mexico. That's what I would tell them, everybody.
So how about, we've talked about this a couple of times. The current U.S. administration has taken a very aggressive stance toward Mexico, including, and I think it's fair to say this is completely new territory where leaders of foreign countries feel compelled to remind us that they're sovereign nations. And that didn't, at least historically, it used to be necessary. And in fact, Mexico's response to some of what the current administration has been asserting is, I believe the quote is, "We're no one's piñata," which I like that statement. Has it affected U.S. business persons' ability to operate effectively? Is there lingering animosity toward U.S. nationals because of the current administration's tariffs and other negative attention?
Personally, I haven't felt it. I've been in Mexico every month since Trump became president again. I'll be there back there next week. And I haven't felt that on the ground animosity. Instead, what I've seen, I think this is directly relevant to your question, Scott, is Scheinbaum has she's shown this real surprising ability to navigate those waters. She's proven herself to be shrewd, to be savvy, to be pragmatic. And so, yes, while you might have the "we aren't anyone's piñata" commentary, at the same time, you have this rolling up your sleeves, this willingness to engage the Trump administration to send 10,000 troops to the Mexican border to engage in tariff negotiations, to, highlight the critical importance of countering fentanyl in the country. So It really has been surprising, and that's the perspective I've heard with my contacts in the business communities in Mexico, both US down there and Mexican business people. So I think that might be, I don't know if the word is a silver lining or a saving grace, but some positive light right now in the relationship, which certainly at times does tend to lean toward the animosity side.
And Mike, how about you? What's been your experience lately? What's the tone?
Yeah, I've found I don't travel to Mexico as much. I usually spend a couple of months out of the year there, and but I'm on the phone practically every day or every other day with a business partner I had there who worked with with their Justice Department for years and a couple of investigators. And I find they sort of I don't find any really negative impact as far as what I've been doing down there or other people that I've spoken to. I think absolutely right on. I find with the people that I've been dealing with, they try to take it with a sense of humor almost, that this is sort of what's to be expected out of Washington in terms of the verbiage. And if they say, in spite of all the negative comments that may come down, business is still booming, tourism is still booming. So you know, I don't see it as being as much of a problem. Not to say that it couldn't get worse, but I think, it's a wait and see. But I'm very positive.
So I think to a certain extent, this next question, you guys may have at least partially answered it, but in terms of our shared border with Mexico, obviously the concern is individuals with bad intent crossing over into the U.S. If our relationship with Mexico deteriorates as a result of some of the things we've been talking about, can we still depend on them to do their part in securing our border from people and organizations who are hostile to the U.S.?
I guess a couple of reactions, Scott. First, the threat is significant. I mean, I had an opportunity to drive from Mexico City to Querétaro about 2 months ago, and Mike mentions Querétaro as one of the more stable parts of the country. I agree. But even that one drive, you really get to see the roving military to address, cartel presence. And you get the sense that the threat is so extensive in the country. And this isn't even, one of the hot spots. So imagine a scenario where relations do break down and you have real insecurity grow throughout, dangerous parts of the country, and businesses have presence in those parts. And I think that is a scenario. I mean, who would have thought we would see decertification in Colombia? Who would have thought we would see sanctions against judges in Brazil? I mean, we are in very dynamic times now. And I think ultimately the point is a scenario like that could happen. There could be breakdown. And it's back to one of Mike's earlier points, contingency planning. Companies need to build into their planning the real possibility that operations will need to be paused at some point. So I guess that's the one piece of feedback I could offer in light of that very valid concern.
And I think that's got a very good point there because I've done that drive a few times, not as many, coming down from through Laredo and then coming into Querétaro, and then working with my business partners. We had some work we were doing close by in Salamanca, basically dealing with companies that were well, and also the local government dealing with issues of the fuel theft, especially around Salamanca and that whole area, which is an extremely dangerous. Once you get off the main highway, you really have to be extremely careful. The huachicoleros that are out there stealing fuel. So again, the contingencies you have to be extremely. You need to be ready for any eventuality, and you need to put that into your planning.
So you guys both have a great deal of experience working in Mexico, and Mike, you spend a great deal of time, extended periods of time there, and you've lived there in the past. What's one thing about doing business in Mexico that's radically different from the U.S. that our audience might find surprising?
Yeah, yeah. Let me. I'll take that one first. I mean,
Yeah.
very interesting what Matt says. Is I do more investigative work down there, so I'm not sort of interacting, but in talking with my business partner, I think the key thing is the formality that's required in first time meetings with the business partner, or even if, well, you're primarily business. The formality is very surprising, but once you've broken through that level, it's the other thing that becomes surprising is how much weight is put on personal relationships and building trust and building rapport. It's a lot more important. At least I've found it to be a lot more important when dealing in Mexico than it is when dealing in the United States. That may not be the case, but I'll defer to Matt on that point since he's had, I think, a lot more experience in that area.
I agree. And, I guess the one thing I would add is, and this is captured in Mexican literature, right? The metaphor of la pantalla, the screen. In Mexico, and this is a trap we see business people fall into over and over again. On one hand, things seem familiar in the Mexican environment. There's a certain story and there's a harmony, but there's also the concept of the screen, la pantalla, and what is happening, what arrangements, what relationships, what activity is happening in a place that's not seeable from where visible from where you stand. And that's where so much of Mexican business and society and wrongdoing is born from. And so I tend to carry that motif into my work in Mexico. It's something I haven't seen in other countries. It's something I think very unique to the Mexican culture. Mexicans will tell you it's true. It really, getting back to the heart of this podcast, fraud eats strategy. That is a very common way that business strategies are turned over in Mexico because, leaders find out there were things happening behind the scenes that they weren't aware of and they had no real reason to know about. And so for fraud practitioners like ourselves, it's important to continue to delve and seek out those arrangements.
Well, those are some great closing remarks, and that's all the time we have today. This has been great. I really enjoyed the both of you and your comments and your insights. And so thank you both for your time today.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you. Just as one parting shot, if you have not listened to it, listen to Scheinbaum's Grito at midnight on the 15th, because her last closing comments are very telling in terms of what the future might bring, how bad it could go.
I'll make a point of doing that. Thanks. So that was White Collar Forensics Mike Belcher and Miller and Chevalier's Matt Ellis. This concludes this episode of Fraud Eats Strategy. I'm Scott Moritz, president of White Collar Forensic. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode. But before you go, if you have an idea about a fraud or corruption case, topic, or guest you think would make for an interesting episode, email us through our website at whitecollarforensic.com. Thank you for listening.